The broadcast came in on the open humanitarian band at 0317 ship time, which meant I was already in the command chair with a cold cup of coffee going, warm again in my hand, watching the fold transit plots refresh on the forward console. I had been awake since 100, not because anything was wrong aboard ESV Ironshore. The ship was tight, the crew was rested. The fold coils were cycling at 94% efficiency, which was excellent for a vessel of her age. But because I had been watching the narrated corridor on the long-range feeds for 11 days, and I had a feeling, the kind that doesn't translate well into official logs, that something was about to break open. The feeling was not mystical. It was the product of 11 days of watching a Threnval siege formation build at a rate that was deliberate rather than urgent. The way you build something when you are confident of the outcome and want everyone watching to understand the confidence. They had staged their outer screening element first, at a distance that said we are here rather than we are attacking. Then the interdiction pattern, which was not a blockade in the conventional sense. It was a statement. 40 vessels over 3 weeks. And on each day, the Veth Coral colony stations in the corridor had called out on the diplomatic channels with increasing urgency. And on each day, the responses from the Conclave and the Hegemony and the Sarathi League had been variations on the same theme. We are monitoring the situation. We encourage all parties to pursue diplomatic avenues. We are not in a position to intervene at this time. I had been reading those responses for 11 days. The reading had been instructive. The broadcast was 17 seconds long. It played twice before my comms officer, Lieutenant Davil Oram, turned in his chair and looked at me with an expression I had learned to read over. 6 years of service together. It was the expression that meant, you are going to want to hear this yourself, and I am going to pretend I did not notice how your face changes when you do. I set the coffee down. Play it again, I said. He played it again. The voice was Veth Coral, that particular register, low and resonant with the subharmonic undertone that their military caste uses for formal transmissions, a sound like stone grinding against stone at the bottom of a well. The translation scrolled on the secondary screen. I did not need the translation. I had been reading Veth Coral military communiques for 8 years, ever since my first posting on the corridor watch rotation. I knew the vocabulary well enough to hear the exact moment the formality cracked. The broadcast said, "This is Admiral Kesh Viral, commanding officer of the 3rd Dominion Expeditionary Group, transmitting from the colony station Akaret 7 on the open emergency band. The Threnval Consolidation has deployed a siege formation in the outer Akaret corridor, numbering not fewer than 40 vessels. The colonies of Akaret 7, Akaretnin, and the Velcor agricultural stations are under active interdiction. Civilian infrastructure is compromised. We have transmitted formal requests for assistance to the Conclave Emergency Council, the Hegemony Mutual Defense Compact, and the Sarathi League. All 3 have declined to intervene at this time. We are transmitting on all bands, including the humanitarian open frequency. This broadcast is for any vessel capable of rendering assistance." Then there was a pause, half a second, barely audible, and the Admiral said, in a register that was no longer formal at all, "We are asking anyone." 17 seconds. She had compressed 40 years of Dominion foreign policy into a pause between 2 sentences, and I had heard every bit of it. Oram was still looking at me. "Get me Commander Vale and Lieutenant Commander Hassett on the bridge," I said, "and pull up the full Akaret corridor tactical plot. Everything we have from the last 96 hours. "Already running," he said, and turned back to his console. I picked up the coffee. It had gone cold again. The Veth Coral Dominion had been a fact of galactic life for longer than human spaceflight had existed. They were an old civilization, not ancient in the way the Conclave's founding species were ancient, but old enough to have developed and discarded 3 distinct military doctrines before humans had figured out the fold transit equations. They were amber-scaled, bipedal, roughly humanoid in the broad architectural sense. with lateral crest plates that rose and spread when they were angry or formal, which in Dominion military culture was most of the time. They were organized into hereditary military castes, with an elaborate hierarchy of honor obligations. And they took their warships very seriously in the way that a civilization takes seriously the thing it has been building for 600 years. They had not always disliked humans. The early contact period, from the first exchange missions through the first 2 generations of diplomatic normalization, had been cautious but not hostile. Humans were new. Humans were energetic. Humans built ships quickly, in large numbers, with an enthusiasm that older civilizations found either charming or alarming, depending on the civilization. The Veth Karal had landed somewhere between the 2 responses for most of that early period. The Hull Assessment Proclamation changed that. It was issued 43 years ago by the Dominion Naval Standards Committee, chaired at the time by a fleet admiral, whose name I had looked up once, and then set aside because the name did not matter, only the document. The proclamation was a formal technical assessment of human vessel construction, as it stood at that time, and it was not entirely wrong in its specifics. Human ships of that era were built quickly, with cheaper materials, because we were building them quickly in large numbers to cover a lot of space with limited resources. The proclamation noted this accurately. What it did not need to do, and what it chose to do anyway, was publish those findings across every diplomatic channel in the galactic community, with a cover memo from the fleet admiral that described human escort vessels as, and I am translating here from the original Veth Karal, structurally provisional constructions unsuitable for sustained engagement or serious escort duty, more appropriately compared to salvage hulls than to warships, representing no meaningful deterrent capability in any scenario requiring genuine military response. That memo was read in every council chamber, every fleet briefing room, every diplomatic reception in the settled galaxy within a month of publication. The Dominion's reasoning had been political, which I understood, even if I did not excuse it. They were in a period of doctrinal competition with the hegemony at the time, contesting influence over several transit corridor agreements, and publicly downgrading human military capability served the purpose of positioning the Dominion as the only credible military power in their quadrant of space. The proclamation was not primarily a technical document. It was a position paper dressed as a technical document, which made it both more insulting and more durable than a simple insult would have been. A simple insult fades. An official assessment with supporting data gets filed in diplomatic archives and cited in briefings for decades. I had been 7 years old when the proclamation was issued. I did not read it until I was 19, in my 2nd year at the Naval Academy, when a professor of galactic relations handed it to the class without comment and asked us to write a response. I remember reading it and feeling something that I could only describe, then and now, as a quiet, flat decision. Not rage, not even resentment, just a very clear, very simple calculation that I was going to spend my career making that assessment obsolete, one operational record at a time, and that I was going to do it without ever mentioning the proclamation again. I had never mentioned it again. I had, however, kept a copy of it in my personal files for 26 years, not as a wound, more the way a navigator keeps a map of a passage that was once declared impassable, as a reference point. My father had served on the corridor watch during the years immediately following the proclamation, when the diplomatic fallout was still fresh and the Veth Karal had taken to conducting what they called routine navigation assessments of human vessels that happened to operate in the vicinity of Dominion-monitored space lanes. They were not inspections. They were not close enough for that. They were an exercise in positioning Veth Karal warships at escort distance, close enough to communicate a message without triggering an incident. And the message was, "We have evaluated you and found you insufficient." My father had spent 2 tours on vessels that spent half their operational time being observed at what the Veth Karal called courtesy range. He had never, as far as I knew, filed a formal complaint. He had also never taken a posting farther from the corridor than the inner ring stations, which I had understood from a young age without either of us saying it directly. I thought about him sometimes, in the 11 days I spent watching the Akaret formation build. I thought he would have appreciated the arithmetic of it. Commander Tal Vale arrived on the bridge 4 minutes after I called for her, which was about what I expected. Vale slept lightly and moved fast, and she had been on the corridor watch nearly as long as I had. She was my executive officer and the best reader of fleet tactical situations I had ever worked with. She looked at the plot I had up on the main display, read it in about 8 seconds, and then looked at me. 40 vessels, she said. 40 confirmed. Orem thinks there may be a screening element another 2 light hours out that the long-range sensors are not fully resolving, call it 50. And the Conclave said no. The Conclave said no. The Hegemony said no. The Sarathi said no. I paused. The Dominion asked anyone. Vale was quiet for a moment. She had a very controlled face. She was Martian-born, which for reasons I had never fully understood, produced a particular flavor of emotional economy, a preference for saying things precisely or not at all, and she used that control now. The proclamation, she said. I am aware of it. The crew is aware of it. I know. She looked at the plot again. Akaret 7 is a colony of 300,000. Akaret 9 is smaller, about 80,000. The Velcor stations are agricultural, mostly automated, but there are residential crews. Call it another 12,000. She paused. 400,000 people, roughly. Yes. And the Threnval are not known for light touch interdiction. No, I said, they are not. The Threnval consolidation was a younger civilization than the Dominion, and considerably more aggressive about expanding what it called its operational perimeter, which was a phrase that meant, in practice, wherever we can push a fleet to and hold. They had been in a low-grade territorial contest with the Dominion for 60 years over the Akaret corridor, which was a region of space that was not particularly valuable in any material sense, but was valuable in the sense that it connected the Dominion's outer colonies to the main transit lanes, and the Threnval had a long-standing interest in making that connection difficult. A siege fleet of 40 vessels was not a raid. It was a statement. If the Conclave declined to intervene, Vale said carefully, it may be because they have assessed the Threnval political dimension and decided that a response creates worse problems than it solves. That is possible. Which means that if we go in, we may be stepping into something the Conclave has decided to let play out. That is also possible. She looked at me directly. And 400,000 people are under siege and no one else is going. I let that sit for a moment. The fleet is already stage tall. We have been watching this build for 11 days. The fold transit plots are computed. The relief package is loaded. We are not going to sit here and have a political conversation while Akaret 7 burns. She did not argue. I had not expected her to. Vale was many things, but she was not someone who mistook caution for wisdom when the calculus was that clear. What is our order of battle? She asked. I pulled up the formation on the secondary display. Ironshore as command vessel. ESV Calderon and ESV Rails Promise as combat support. The hospital ship ESV Steady Hand. 3 relief transports. Odom's convoy, already holding at the fold transit waypoint. 2 corvettes for screen. I paused. 8 vessels total. She studied the formation against a Threnval siege group of 40 to 50. Yes, they are going to see us coming. That is the intention. She understood what I meant. The Threnval were aggressive, but they were not stupid. And what humans had spent 43 years building, quietly, steadily, without press releases or proclamations, was a reputation. Not for the size of our fleets, which were not the largest in the settled galaxy, and not for the sophistication of our weapons technology, which was good but not exceptional. A reputation for a very specific thing, that when humans showed up to a fight, they had already decided how it ended, and they were correct more often than any civilization had any right to be. The Threnval had read those records. Every spacefaring civilization had read those records, because unlike the Dominion's hull assessment proclamation, The records were not filed in diplomatic channels. They were written in operational logs and after-action reports and the quiet arithmetic of engagements that should have gone one way and went another. They accumulated the way interest accumulates, slowly, then undeniably. Hassett arrived from the engineering deck 2 minutes after Vale, still pulling his duty jacket on, and took the tactical display in with the focused speed of a man who had been anticipating this briefing for 11 days without being told he was anticipating it. That was the other thing about a good crew. They watch what you watch. They notice what you notice. They do not ask why the captain has been running fold transit plots for 11 consecutive days on a corridor that is not currently under any formal alert status. They simply run their own contingency calculations and make sure their departments are ready. "Fold coils?" I asked him. "Ready for full transit on your order," he said. "I'd like another 40 minutes for the tertiary redundancy check on coil 3, but she'll run clean without it. I won't ask for the 40 minutes. "You've got 20, I said. "Start the pre-transit sequence." He nodded and went back to the engineering deck. I looked at Vale. She was already drafting the fleet formation order. "Make the fold transit call," I said. "Fleet formation, combat spacing, relief package in center. I want steady hand inside the defensive perimeter from the moment we arrive. Orem, tight beam the Veth Corral emergency channel. Reference the broadcast timestamp. Tell them we are inbound and to hold their position." "Understood," Orem said. "Captain, do you want me to identify the sending authority on our transmission?" I thought about that for 1 second. "Yes," I said. "Full identification. ESV Ironshore, Captain Marin Solis commanding. Human Relief and Security Detachment, Corridor Watch." I picked up the coffee again. "Let them know it's us." The fold transit from our holding position to the outer Akaret corridor was 11 hours and 40 minutes at standard transit speed. I spent most of it reviewing what we had on the Threnval siege formation, briefing my combat department heads, and walking the ship. I walk the ship when I am thinking. It is a habit I developed in my first command and never lost. Ironshore was a Callaway-class multipurpose response vessel, which meant she was larger than a frigate and smaller than a cruiser, and designed to do everything moderately well rather than any one thing, exceptionally, which was in practice exactly what you needed for the kind of operations the Corridor Watch ran. She was 14 years old. Her hull plating had been replaced twice, her fold coils rebuilt once, and her medical suite upgraded 3 times as the hospital ship protocols evolved. She was not pretty in the way that newer vessels were pretty, with their clean lines and integrated sensor arrays. She had the look of a ship that had been used, repaired in the field, modified to fit the work, carrying the marks of a decade and a half of operational history in the texture of her corridors and the particular way her frame settled when she was in transit. I loved her unreservedly, which was not something I said aloud but was nonetheless true. On my second walkthrough, I passed through the enlisted mess and found a table of 8 ratings who were having a conversation that stopped when I appeared in the doorway, and then resumed when I waved them back to it. I leaned against the bulkhead and listened for a moment. They were talking about the proclamation, not bitterly, not with the heat of fresh grievance. They were talking about it the way people talk about something that has been sitting in the back of the room for a long time and has now, without ceremony, become relevant, with a kind of quiet, almost academic interest in how it was all going to play out. Specialist Kura, who ran the environmental systems and had been with Ironshore for 9 years, was saying, "The thing I keep thinking about is the Admiral. Varal. She's the one who ran the proclamation through the Naval Committee when she was a junior flag officer. It's in the diplomatic record. She co-authored the supplemental assessment. So she's the one who said our ships were salvage hulls," said the rating next to her. A young man named Ferris, who I was fairly sure had enlisted specifically because of the proclamation, the way some young people enlist because of an insult. She's the one who signed the document that said it, yes. And now she's the one calling us. There was a pause around the table. Captain Solis is going anyway, Ferris said. It was not quite a question. Kura looked up and saw me in the doorway. She did not look startled. Captain Solis is going anyway, she said, with the particular tone of someone confirming a known constant. I nodded once and continued the walkthrough. The rest of the transit was quiet in the way that transits are quiet when everyone aboard knows what is waiting on the other side. A focused stillness, people at their stations or their bunks or their meal tables, processing privately, not speaking about the thing they were all thinking about. I have been on ships that handled that stillness poorly, where it became a weight that leaked into the work, made people hesitant or over-careful or prone to second-guessing. Ironshore was not that kind of ship. The stillness on Ironshore was the stillness of people who had decided something and were moving toward it with their eyes open. I appreciated it every time. We dropped out of Fold Transit at 0641 ship time, at the outer marker of the Akaret corridor, and I had the tactical display on the main screen before the transit shimmer had fully cleared. The Threnval siege formation was exactly where the long-range feeds had shown it, spread across a rough arc from the inner system to the transit lane intersection, 43 vessels confirmed by the initial sensor sweep, with what looked like a screening element of 7 additional ships at the far edge of the arc. 50 vessels total, give or take. They were not moving. The Akaret 7 colony station was visible on the plot as a fixed position marker, showing active life support and power signatures, but no outbound traffic. The siege cordon was holding. Fleet disposition confirmed, Vale said from her station. We are at combat spacing. Steady hand is center formation. Relief transports are tucked in behind Calderon. Good. Orem, open a broadband channel to the Threnval fleet. Standard hail, identification, our current formation, and a statement of intent. Statement of intent? Tell them we are here to render humanitarian assistance to the colony stations under their cordon. Tell them we intend to pass through their formation and reach the stations. Tell them we are requesting clear passage. Orem drafted it and played it back to me. I approved it, and he transmitted. The response took 4 minutes, which was almost polite by Threnval standards. The senior communications officer, on their lead vessel, replied in the flat, clipped register the Threnval used for official exchanges, which I had always thought like someone reading a legal document aloud under protest. The translation read, Human Vessel Group, you are in proximity to an active Threnval security operation. The stations under cordon are under provisional Threnval jurisdiction, pursuant to Corridor Compact Article 14. We advise you to withdraw. Acknowledged, I said to Orem. Reply, we have received your advisory. We note it. We are proceeding. There was a longer pause this time. 6 minutes. Then the Threnval reply, Human Vessel Group, you are instructed to stand down. Our formation is authorized to enforce the cordon. Reply, we understand you are authorized. We are proceeding regardless. Our intent is humanitarian. We are not here to contest your compact claim. We are here to reach the stations. I paused. Add, we have 8 vessels, one of which is a hospital ship. Our combat group consists of 2 support vessels and 2 corvettes. If you want to have a conversation about who is authorized to do what in this corridor, we are prepared to have that conversation after the civilian population is out of immediate danger. Vale looked at me from across the bridge. She did not say anything. The next pause was 11 minutes. I had Orem keep the channel open and watch the tactical display while we waited. The Threnval formation had not moved, but the sensor returns were showing a distinct change in their active radar profiles. They were painting targets, which meant they were running weapons solutions. Whether they intended to use them was a different question. Vale moved to stand beside me at the main display. She had a handheld plot reader in one hand, and she was watching the formation with the particular stillness she used when she was doing mathematics in her head that she did not want interrupted. They've separated their screening element, she said quietly. The 7 ships at the arc's edge have changed heading by 14 degrees. They're not moving toward us. They're repositioning laterally. covering their withdrawal lane," I said. "Or they've decided that if this goes wrong, they want a clean exit that doesn't cross our relief transports." She paused. "That's a decision you make when you're not certain you're going to shoot." "Yes. They're still running targeting solutions. They'll run them until they decide either way. Running solutions is not a commitment." I watched the formation. The fleet commander is having a conversation right now, probably with someone who has read our operational records. Vale was quiet for a moment. "We have 4 engagements in our specific records where the Ironshore was formally cited in after-action analysis by opposing forces as a factor in outcome assessment." "I'm aware of the citations. The most recent one was the Vesh Corridor incident 14 months ago. The Threnval consolidation has 3 vessels that participated in that incident. I can see 2 of them in the current formation from the hull designators." I looked at her. "You pulled the hull designators." "I pulled them during the transit," she said, in the tone of someone who has done a thing she considered entirely obvious. "I thought it might be relevant." I looked back at the formation. 8 vessels against 50 is a straightforward calculation for any commanding officer who has not read what is in those records. For a commanding officer who has read them, the calculation is less straightforward, because the records include 17 specific engagements in which human forces operating at comparable or greater disadvantage produced outcomes. That should not have been possible by conventional tactical analysis. The Vesh Corridor incident had involved 2 of our corvettes and a much larger Threnval patrol group, and the outcome of that incident was still discussed in certain fleet circles in terms that I found both gratifying and slightly unnerving. I did not know if the Threnval fleet commander had read the records. I was fairly certain someone on that flagship had. The Threnval reply when it came was 6 words in translation. "We will not impede your passage." I let out a breath I had not been aware I was holding. "Orem, acknowledge. Thank them." I looked at the plot. "Fleet, advance. Steady hand to move up on my mark. Relief transports to prepare for dock approach on Akaret 7. Commander Vale, I want a continuous watch on that Threnval formation. If anything shifts, I want to know immediately." We moved through the cordon at a steady advance speed, which was slow enough to be deliberate and fast enough to show we were not hesitating. The Threnval vessels did not move. Some of them began to alter their heading slightly, not aggressively, more the way a formation shifts when it is recalculating its own position relative to a new variable. I watched that and noted it and said nothing about it. The first visual contact with Akaret 7 came up on the main display 17 minutes after we cleared the cordon's outer edge. The colony station was a mid-scale orbital construction, built in the Veth Karal style, which meant dense, angular, layered with external armor plating that gave it the look of a fortified structure more than a civilian habitat. It was showing damage on its exterior hull, moderate but visible. There had been at least 1 engagement before the siege settled into its current holding pattern. Its navigational lights were on. Its docking approach beacons were active. And on the broadband channel, before I had even ordered a hail, a Veth Karal voice came through with a formality that was doing a great deal of work to hold itself together. "ESV Ironshore, this is Akaret 7 station control. We confirm your approach. We confirm your identification." A pause. "We were not certain you would come." "We are here," I said. "Begin your dock approach coordination with my relief transports. We have medical personnel aboard steady hand ready to transfer on your authorization. What is your most critical need?" The pause this time was not formal. It was the pause of someone who has been holding a dam in place for days and has just been told it is no longer entirely their problem. "Medical," the station controller said. "Power grid stabilization. Food stores are sufficient for 6 more days. We have 312 injured requiring treatment above our station capacity." "Understood. Steady hand is moving to dock on your medical port. My engineers will transfer for grid work within the hour." I looked at Vale. "Get me a line to Admiral Varall." She came aboard 2 hours later. I had expected to meet her at the docking port. and I had briefly, with formal exchange of identification credentials, which were her 3 Dominion military honors and my 2 human campaign ribbons, and then a short walk to the briefing room adjacent to the bridge. But I had also watched her come through the port, and that was the thing I had not expected to find so instructive. Admiral Keshvaral was tall for a Vethkaral, which meant she was slightly taller than I was, with the amber scaling that gave her caste, its designation, and the lateral crest plates that marked senior flag rank. They were extended slightly, which in Vethkaral body language indicated either high formality or suppressed agitation, and I suspected both. She moved with the particular deliberate precision of a military officer who had spent decades ensuring that every movement she made in public communicated exactly what she intended it to. She was in her duty uniform, which was damaged. There was scoring along the left shoulder plate that had been cleaned but not repaired. She walked through the docking port of ESV Ironshore, a hull class that the document she had co-authored had described as structurally provisional and unsuitable for sustained engagement, and she looked at the corridor walls and the overhead lighting and the rated crew moving past her on their tasks, and she said nothing. I watched her eyes move. Not obviously, she was far too controlled for that, but I had been reading people in confined spaces for 20 years, and there were small adjustments in her focus that told me she was looking at specific things. The overhead cable management, which on Ironshore was built into reinforced channels rather than run in open conduit, heavier, but able to take localized damage without cascading failure. The emergency seals on the pressure doors, which on a 14-year-old Callaway class should, by the proclamation's assessment, have been showing wear-related degradation and were instead in clean operational condition because Hassett ran a full seal inspection every 90 days without exception. The rating who passed us in the corridor, pushing a cart of medical supplies toward the dock interface, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who knew exactly where she was going and exactly how long it would take. These were not the corridors of a salvage hull. I did not point this out. I would not point it out. That was not what we were doing here. In the briefing room, I spread the tactical situation on the table between us. Akrit 7, 9, and the Velcor stations, the Threnval formation, our current fleet disposition, and the relief timeline my logistics officer had prepared. Varal studied it with the complete, unbroken attention of someone who had been looking at a bad situation for days, and was now, for the first time, looking at a version of it that might resolve. The Threnval withdrew their interdiction, she said. It was not quite a question. They stood aside. I told them our intent was humanitarian and that we were proceeding regardless. She looked at me. Her crest plates were very still, and they accepted that. They calculated their position. I think their siege was always more political than military. They wanted the conclave to see the Dominion without support. Once we were here, the calculation changed. The conclave will note your presence. The conclave notes everything. She was quiet for a moment. The conclave declined to intervene because a Dominion Threnval resolution without conclave mediation serves conclave interests. The hegemony declined because they have a pending transit agreement with the Threnval. The Sarathi declined because they have an outstanding territorial dispute with the Dominion and saw no advantage in reducing our leverage position. She said it precisely, without apparent bitterness, the way you recite the mechanics of a trap after you have already fallen into it. We called everyone, I know. We called everyone for 4 days before the Threnval moved to full interdiction. She paused. We transmitted on the humanitarian open band as a measure of last resort. We did not expect a response. Nevertheless, I said. She looked at the tactical display. You were already in fold transit when we broadcast. We had been watching the corridor for 11 days, I said. The siege formation had been building for 2 weeks before that. When the Threnval committed to full interdiction, we staged for transit. Before we called, yes, her crest plates moved, a slight settling, Not quite a spread and not quite a retraction, something in between that I did not have a full reading for, but which in context felt like the physical equivalent of a very careful recalculation. You came before we asked. We were coming when you asked. The timeline happened to align. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the briefing room viewport, a small one, aft-facing, I could see the lights of Akrat-7's dock approach beacons, and behind them, just visible at the edge of the frame, the running lights of ESV Steady Hand alongside the station's medical port. Captain Solis, Voral said finally, in a register that was no longer doing any formal work at all. I am aware of the proclamation. I am aware that you are aware of it. I am aware that every officer on this vessel is aware of it. Yes, I said. I co-authored the supplemental assessment. I know. It was an accurate assessment of human vessel construction at that time. I looked at her directly. Yes, I said, it was. She absorbed that. The conclusion, the characterization, was excessive. That is not an apology. I am not certain what the appropriate framework is. She stopped. For a Veth Karal senior flag officer in dress uniform in an official briefing, it was an extraordinary thing to stop mid-sentence. I am not certain what framework adequately addresses this situation. Admiral, I said, there is no framework. We came because people are in danger. That is the entire reason. I paused. The proclamation is 43 years old. I filed it under reference materials and stopped thinking about it. It was not entirely true. But it was true enough for this room, and for this conversation, which was not the conversation about the proclamation. It was the conversation about everything that had happened since. The relief operation ran for 71 hours. I have written operational summaries for 17 major response actions in my career, and they tend to read similarly in retrospect. A sequence of logistics problems, resource allocations, personnel decisions, and field adjustments, each one manageable in isolation and collectively exhausting. The Akaret operation was those things. It was also, underneath those things, something harder to put into a log. The Threnval held position throughout the operation. They did not withdraw. They remained at their siege coordinates, watching, but they did not interfere. And on the second day, their fleet commander transmitted a formal notification that they were suspending active interdiction, pending diplomatic review, which was the Threnval way of saying, we are going to pretend this was always going to resolve this way. I acknowledged the notification without comment and kept our formation between them and the stations. ESV Steady Hand processed the 312 critical cases within the first 48 hours. My engineering team, led by a lieutenant named Bohr, who had the gift of treating every crisis as an interesting technical problem rather than an emergency, completed the power grid stabilization on Akaret 7 and 9 within 36 hours. Bohr was methodical in a way that bordered on musical. He had a particular habit of talking through his diagnostic process aloud in a low, continuous murmur that his team had learned to follow like a thread through a maze. And the Veth Karal station engineers who worked alongside him during the grid repairs had, by the end of the first day, adopted a kind of quiet attentiveness to his narration that reminded me of something I had seen once in a field hospital, the way frightened people orient toward competence. The grid on Akaret 7 was in worse shape than the initial assessment had indicated. There had been a direct hit on the tertiary distribution node during the engagement that preceded the siege, and the station engineers had been running on bypass routing for 3 weeks, which was the kind of sustained workaround that works until it doesn't, and tells you exactly how capable the people running it are by the fact that it held as long as it did. The lead station engineer, a Veth Karal technical officer of the middle caste, a broad-shouldered figure named something I could not fully render in my phonology, had rigged the bypass with a combination of standard components and improvised bridging elements that Bohr examined for a long time before pronouncing good work, a phrase that in Bohr's vocabulary carried real weight. The station engineer's crest plates did not visibly move at that, but there was something in the stillness of them, a held quality, that I had learned to read as the Veth Karal equivalent of a released breath. Bohr's team replaced the node, rerouted the primary feeds, and had the station at full power capacity in 22 hours. When the lights came fully on in the residential sections, there was a sound that Bohr described in his engineering log as difficult to characterize, which was as close as a Bohr report ever got to the word moving. The Velcor agricultural stations were in better shape than the initial reports had suggested. Their damage was superficial, and their residential crews had handled the siege with a stoicism that the station controller attributed to the fact that agricultural workers in the outer Dominion reaches had always operated on the assumption that no one was coming if something went wrong. That assumption may need revision, I told the Velcor station chief, a grizzled Veth Karal of the laborer caste rather than the military, who had met our engineering team with a handshake instead of a formal honor exchange, and had fed Bohr's entire team from the station's stores. Assumptions are slow to revise, the station chief said. But the food was worth eating. Tell your engineers that, I told Bohr. He seemed pleased. Admiral Viral worked from the briefing room adjacent to my bridge for most of the operation, coordinating with her own remaining staff and interfacing with the station controllers. She was competent and direct, and she did not require hand-holding, which I had expected but was glad to confirm. She had brought 2 aides, both young officers, both Veth Karal military caste, both of whom spent the first day finding reasons to walk through different sections of the ship and looking at things with an expression that I recognized from my own first experience of being aboard a vessel class I had previously only seen in technical assessments. On the second day, one of them, a junior lieutenant named something I will approximate as Voss, because his name was one of those Veth Karal honorific constructs that defeated my pronunciation, found his way to the engine room and apparently had a 2-hour conversation with my chief engineer about fold coil construction methodology that ended with my chief engineer giving him a formal tour and Voss filing a written request through Admiral Viral's office to access our maintenance manuals. I approved the request. Viral came to the bridge door on the second evening and said, without preamble, "Lieutenant Voss has asked to be allowed to take physical copies of your maintenance manuals when we transfer back to the station. I have authorized his request on behalf of the Dominion Naval Technical Review Committee, if that is acceptable to you." "It's acceptable," I said. She stood in the bridge doorway for a moment. "He has been talking to your engineer for most of the afternoon. Chief Amara is happy to talk about coil construction to anyone who will listen. Your lieutenant has apparently been listening. He told me." She stopped, started again. "He told me the fold coil redundancy architecture was not what he had been taught to expect." "It's not elegant," I said. "It's built to fail safely under 3 different failure modes and then keep running. It adds mass and it costs efficiency. We decided a long time ago that we preferred the ship to keep going rather than to go faster." She was quiet. "Then, that is a different design philosophy than ours." "Yes," I said. She left the doorway without further comment. I watched her go and thought about the Hull Assessment Proclamation, which had noted, accurately, that human vessels of that era were heavier and slower than their Veth Karal equivalents due to redundant system architecture, that the assessment characterized as indicating inferior confidence in primary construction. The assessment had been right about the redundancy. It had made an interpretation of what the redundancy meant that was, in the most important operational sense, entirely wrong. The transfer of survivors from Akaret 9 was the hardest part of the operation, not because of any tactical difficulty, but because of simple scale. Akaret 9 was a colony of 80,000, and while the majority were in stable condition, the siege had lasted long enough to create genuine resource depletion. Food rationing, water recycling under strain, medical supplies at critical lows for 3 weeks. The station looked, when we docked the first relief transport, like a place that had been holding on through will rather than adequate resources, And the expression on the faces of the civilians who came through the dock was the particular expression of people who had, on some level, stopped believing they would see a ship come through. My relief teams, I should be precise about this, were not dramatic. They were not dramatic the way that military rescues are sometimes depicted. No speeches, no ceremony, no pausing for the weight of the moment. They were doctors and engineers and logistics specialists who had trained for this, who had run this drill dozens of times, and who moved through the work with the particular efficiency of people who know exactly what they are doing and are focused entirely on doing it well. The emergency ration distribution was organized and fast. The medical triage was calm and thorough. The water recycling supplementation from Iron Shore's reserves was coordinated to the hour. The civilians watched them work with expressions that, in my experience, are always the same, regardless of species or culture or how long the wait had been. A kind of unsteady relief, the look of a weight being lifted from somewhere behind the eyes. I was on Akaret 9 for 4 hours personally, overseeing the initial landing field coordination. And on my way back to the dock, I walked through the distribution center and watched my people work, and then I watched the Veth Karal civilians around them. A woman, I am using the term loosely. Veth Karal gender categories are not identical to human ones, but she had the bearing and the physical markers of someone who had been carrying primary responsibility for a family unit through the siege, was watching one of my medics settle an elderly Veth Karal on a stretcher with the same focused, unhurried gentleness that Steady Hands' medical team brought to every transfer. The medic, a young woman named Physician's Mate second-class tenor, who had been out of training for 18 months, was talking to the elderly patient in the even, reassuring cadence that the medical corps trained for, not knowing if the translation relay was working well enough for the words to land, relying on the tone instead. The Veth Karal woman watching this had her hands clasped in front of her chest, in what I knew was a Veth Karal gesture of formal appeal, the posture you adopt when asking something of someone who has power over your petition. She was not asking anything. She was simply standing, watching her elder being cared for, and holding that posture the way you hold something when you have been carrying it for a long time and are not yet sure it is safe to put it down. I thought about the Hull Assessment Proclamation again, not with any particular feeling, just as a fact sitting in the same room as another fact, 43 years. A document that said these ships and these people were not worth serious consideration. And here were these ships, and here were these people, doing what they had come to do, and not one of them had mentioned the document once. Specialist Kura was running the environmental systems hookup on the station's secondary water processing unit when I passed her. She had a diagnostic tablet in one hand and was talking to a Veth Karal station tech about flow rate calibration. They were using hand gestures to cover the vocabulary gap where the translation system lagged. The station tech was, based on the caste markings I could read, laborer caste, not military, not administrative. Just someone who maintained the systems that kept 80,000 people alive. He was watching Kura's hands as she walked him through the calibration sequence, and he had the look of someone who was concentrating very hard and was also, underneath the concentration, somewhere near tears. I kept walking. On the morning of the third day, with the relief operation in its final phase and the last of the critical transfers complete, Varal came to the bridge and stood at the forward viewport without speaking. I was at the command chair going through the final departure checklist with Vale, and I let her stand there for a while before I walked over. The viewport showed the outer corridor, the Threnval formation still holding at distance, the 3 colony stations with their navigation lights on and their dock bays lit, and beyond them the ambient light of the system's star, giving everything a warm amber cast that, as far as I knew, was not significant to Veth Karal aesthetics, but which had always struck me as appropriate for a species with amber scaling. Iron Shore's forward lights were on. Steady Hand was completing her final dock release, The relief transports were pulling back to formation spacing. It looked from this angle like a fleet departing after a successful operation, which was what it was. 412,000 people, Voral said. She was still looking at the viewport. That is the current count. There were fatalities before you arrived. The siege engagement, the resource depletion, 67 in total. She paused. 412,000 survived. Yes, the conclave has already filed a formal inquiry regarding our request for intervention and their denial. The hegemony has issued a statement indicating that the situation resolved satisfactorily through private humanitarian action. She said the last three words with a dryness that would have been imperceptible without the undertone shift that I had learned. Over 8 years on the corridor watch, to read as Veth al-Karal for what I actually think about this is not what I am permitted to say officially. I read the hegemony statement, I said. You did. It is interesting phrasing, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Her crest plates were in that in-between position again, not spread, not retracted. Sitting at a particular angle that I had been observing for 3 days and had tentatively categorized as something like, I am processing more than I am showing, and I am aware that you can see that, and I am not certain how I feel about either of those things. Captain Solis, she said finally, I need to say something, and I am aware that the appropriate formal structure for what I am about to say does not exist in Dominion Protocol, which may indicate a gap in Dominion Protocol. I waited. You came before we asked. She said it precisely, the way she said most things. You had been watching the corridor for 11 days. You staged your fleet before the broadcast. You came. A pause. Not because we deserved it. Not because the proclamation deserved an answer. Not because of any obligation, diplomatic or otherwise, that would have compelled this. You came because... She stopped. She was looking at the viewport. I could have let her finish the sentence. There were several ways to finish it, and most of them were true. Because 400,000 people needed help. Because that is what we do. Because the proclamation was 43 years ago, and neither of us was the same person as the people who wrote or read it first. Because there is no framework for this, as she had said herself, and the absence of a framework is not a reason to do nothing. I let her stop, and then I said it for her. Because it was the right thing to do, Admiral. That's the only reason we keep in the log. She turned from the viewport and looked at me for a moment with an expression that I could not fully read. Not because it was blank, but because it was too full, all the different things at once, the relief and the shame and the recalculation and something older and quieter, underneath all of it that I chose not to try to name. Then she said, Voss has asked whether he may correspond with your Chief Amara regarding the coil redundancy architecture. Tell him yes, I said. Tell him Amara will write back. We cleared the outer Akaret corridor at 1400 ship time and entered fold transit for home at 1430. The Threnval formation had been withdrawing for 6 hours by then, not in response to anything we had said or done in the final phase. Just a gradual reorientation that said, without words, that the siege was over and that certain calculations had been permanently revised. I watched their formation on the long-range feed until fold transit took them off the display. Admiral Voral transferred back to Akaret 74 hours before our departure, with her aides and Lieutenant Voss, and a data card from Chief Amara that I was informed contained 300 pages of maintenance documentation, annotated in Amara's characteristically thorough style. She shook my hand at the docking port, a human gesture, which the Veth Karal do not use natively, which she had clearly researched, and held it for a moment with the particular gravity of someone who has decided that if there is no existing protocol, you invent one. The proclamation will be reviewed, she said. I cannot speak to the outcome, but I can tell you that I intend to submit a supplemental assessment. You don't have to do that on our account, I said. No. She looked at me. I am doing it because it was wrong, and I wrote part of it, and that is a thing that can be corrected. She paused. The Dominion Naval Standards Committee meets in 4 months. I'll look for the publication, I said. She released my hand and walked back through the docking port with her aides, and I watched the port seal behind them. And then I stood there in the dock corridor for a moment and thought about 43 years, and about 412,000 people in amber light, and about a junior lieutenant learning fold coil redundancy architecture in a ship he had been taught to regard as a provisional construction. Then I walked back to the bridge. Orem was at his console when I settled back into the command chair, and he handed me a coffee that was, for once, the right temperature. "How did you time that?" I asked. "I've been timing it for 6 years," he said. "I know how long the walk from the docking port takes." I took the coffee and looked at the fold transit display. Ironshore was running smooth, 94% coil efficiency again, the same as when we left. Steady Hand was in formation to port. The relief transports were tucked behind Calderon. The corvettes were at screen spacing, watchful and quiet. Vale came to stand beside the command chair. She had the after-action preliminary in her hand, ready for me to review when I was ready to review it. She did not push it at me. She just held it and looked at the fold transit display and said nothing for a moment. I noticed that Ferris was at his station on the secondary sensor board. He had been moved there from the environmental deck for the operational phase, which was a cross-training rotation we ran whenever the crew was up to strength. He was logging his sensor data with the focused attention of a rating who was aware of being observed and was performing his work correctly rather than impressively, which was the right instinct. I had watched him through the operation. The young man who I suspected had enlisted because of a 43-year-old document, and what I had seen was someone who had arrived at the Akaret corridor expecting something and found, instead, that it was just work. Complex, demanding, sometimes frightening work, done by people who had trained for it and were doing it because it needed doing. I thought he had found that more useful than whatever he had expected. "The Threnval are going to file a formal counterstatement with the Conclave," Vale said. "Political pressure on the Hegemony Transit Agreement as leverage." "They'll file it," I said. "The Conclave will review it in committee for 6 months and issue guidance encouraging all parties to pursue diplomatic resolution through established channels. And meanwhile, the Akaret stations are operational. 400,000 people are alive. And Amara has a new pen pal." I took a sip of the coffee. "I'll take that arithmetic." Vale made a sound that, from her, was approximately equivalent to a laugh. She handed me the after-action preliminary. I took it and set it on the armrest for later. "Captain," Orem said from his console without turning around, "I have an incoming tight beam from Akaret 7 station control. It came in during the dock transfer, and I held it for you. Play it." It was the station controller, the same voice that had met us on arrival 3 days earlier. The voice that had said we were not certain you would come. The transmission was brief. It said, "ESV Ironshore, Captain Solis. The grid is holding. The medical transfer is complete. We have confirmed 412,000, one more than the count when you departed. A birth 2 hours ago in the station medical bay. The parents have asked to know if there is a human name for the child that carries the meaning of something you did not expect to arrive." I held the coffee in both hands for a moment. "Orem," I said, "send back a reply. Tell them the word is grace. It works in most languages." He sent it. I looked at the fold transit display for a while, watching the stars go long and then longer as Ironshore found her speed, and thought that in 4 months, Admiral Voral would walk into the Dominion Naval Standards Committee with a supplemental assessment, and that somewhere in a colony station, 80,000 people, deep a child was going to grow up with a name that meant something that arrived when no one expected it. I drank the coffee. It was exactly the right temperature.